Cromwell's lasting achievements was the institution of parish registers. The registration of baptisms, marriages and deaths, which he began in 1538. People didn't want this to happen. They usually put the worst construction on his measures, and they thought it was paving the way for the introduction of a new tax. It was, of course, a powerful means of gathering information for government, and information was what Tudor governments lacked. But of course, taking the long view, it does seem a necessary step in nation building, to know who you are, where you came from. We tend to think of the medieval parish as being rather cosy, tight-knit and cohesive. But, of course, memories of who's who are short-lived in an age before mass literacy. The generations themselves were short, so that many people didn't know their grandparents. And the family line, as we call it, is soon crossed and recrossed and rubbed out. And before parish registers, the English were blundering around, not knowing who they were, and forever marrying their cousins. And we know this because suits about these marriages came up so often before the church courts. I haven't time to talk about Cromwell as a religious reformer, but the clearest of his lasting achievements was the Great Bible. He'd been a patron and a protector of translators ever since he had influence. And acting as Henry's deputy in the English church, he issued injunctions that the Bible in English was to be placed in every parish church for people to read freely. He organised the printing, he picked up the printer's bill, and he bargained to keep the selling price down for better distribution. And once given, the Bible in English couldn't easily be taken away. It was a huge cultural shift. People cared profoundly about their new Bible. We know this because the government issued successive injunctions telling people not to argue about the Holy Scriptures in alehouses. So we know that's just what they did. Fueled a great and lasting debate. And Cromwell also suggested what clergymen should preach. Going to the pulpit, he said, tell people that their children should have a better life than they had. They should bring up their children, he said, in good literature or in a trade. And that was the way to stop them becoming criminals. That was the way to give them membership in the commonweal, in the body politic, the way to buy them into the social contract. Of course, it was disturbing to some people. Why should your children be any different from you? What was working against Cromwell was the weight of a society that was still semi-feudal in many respects. He was trying to break its rules. He'd broken them in his own person. He hadn't come up through the church. Like other councillors from humble backgrounds, he'd come up in his own way. And when he first joined the King's Council, it was put to him that, now surely he must have some ancestors worth talking about. Wasn't there a noble family called Cromwell that had declined? Now he must be one of them. Would he like their coat of arms? No, he said. I wouldn't wear another man's coat, he said. Now for a man on the make of the 16th century, that was an astonishing gesture. To us it seems an instance of integrity, but to his contemporaries it was plain alarming, as if he didn't care about his humble birth. Of course, it wasn't just the nobility who convicted him of being an upstart. Ordinary people were just as conservative in their instincts. Most people agreed that government was the business of lords. And for a man like Cromwell to be the king's right-hand man was somehow unnatural, ungodly. So, how had he obtained power over the mind of the king? He must be a sorcerer, was the answer. The rumour ran around that he had a magic ring which had been given to him by Cardinal Wolsey, who was also a sorcerer, of course, and governed by rumour. Rumours that, as well as dissolving the monasteries, Cromwell was going to knock the parish churches down, and that he was going to stop poor men eating white bread, and that if you wanted roast goose for your dinner, you'd have to pay a special tax. It was very seldom that the voice of popular protest was raised against Henry. It was always directed against his low, evil counsellors, that's to say, Cromwell. And of course, if you were Henry's servant, he took credit for your successes, and he blamed you alone for your failures. So working against him, the rational forces, entrenched interests in the Commons and Lords, also the fact that the king was so conservative in religious matters. Henry wanted to break from Rome. He wanted to enjoy the Pope's revenue, but he didn't want doctrinal change. But over and above that, he was working against fear of the new. And this is where the Tudors are so strange to us. This is where they're so different. If you wanted to do something new, you had to present it as something old. So when Henry broke with Rome, his supremacy in the church had to be presented as not a bold new move, but a bold old move. All those centuries of papal jurisdiction in England had to be presented as a derogation from a previously ideal state of affairs, and precedents had to be uncovered to show that really, ideally, and in the good old days, the King of England had always been head of his own church. So the Reformation was a case of full speed ahead, back to the past. Now I can only imagine that this way of thinking was a strain on Cromwell. He was not a man who would have wished to be caught in possession of yesterday's ideas. He bore the strain till his fall from power in 1540, by which time he'd risen to be Earl of Essex, a long way from Brewery Lane in Putney, but he was condemned under the title of Thomas Cromwell, shearsman. He'd once been a wool trader, and in the eyes of the law, he was a wool trader again when he died on the scaffold. He is a study in reputation. He was a hero to the Elizabethans, and John Fox, writing as an Elizabethan, tended to believe that everything would be better, everything, if only Lord Cromwell were alive to keep a hand on it now. Everything, even fashion. And if you can call to mind Elizabethan portraits, particularly of men, think of what they're wearing, their strange nether garments, and you'll see in your mind's eye what Fox was complaining of. He says, if Lord Cromwell were now in our day alive, with the same authority which he had, and saw these new-fangled fashions of attire used here amongst us, both of men and women, I suppose verily, that neither these monstrous ruffs, nor these prodigious hose, and prodigal, or rather hyperbolical, barbarous breeches, which seem rather like barrels than breeches, would have had any place in England. So Cromwell as fashion police, quite a thought. Cromwell as an Elizabethan, or Cromwell in any age, we could always use one.